Alright, for 36, draw a picture of each of the following and include the components of the definition. So for parallelogram, what makes the four-sided figure a parallelogram is that the opposite sides are parallel. For a rectangle, what makes it a rectangle is that we have four right angles. What makes a rhombus is we have four congruent sides. And what makes a square is we have four congruent sides with four right angles. Alright, so now let's talk about the properties of a parallelogram. One of the things we know is that the opposite sides are congruent. So whenever we see a parallelogram, we know that the opposite sides are congruent. Another property is the opposite angles are congruent. So that means that this acute angle is going to be congruent to this acute angle, and this obtuse angle is going to be congruent to this obtuse angle. Another thing we know are that the diagonals bisect each other. So whenever you have a parallelogram and they have the diagonals, we know that they have been bisected. Now in a parallelogram, the diagonals are not congruent. They bisect each other. Another property is that the diagonals, actually, before we say that, the consecutive angles are supplementary. That just means they add up to 180. So that would mean that this angle and this angle add up to 180, but also this angle with this angle would also equal 180. And you can actually work your way around. So this angle and this angle also equal 180. And that's because the lines are parallel and these are same side interior angles. And then the last one I like to include is that the diagonals create alternate interior angles. And so if I just draw one diagonal, this creates these alternate interior angles, and it also creates these alternate interior angles. And the same is true for the other diagonal, but I'm not going to draw it. I don't want to clutter rectangle. Now, a rectangle is a parallelogram, so it includes all these properties, but it has one extra special thing, is that the diagonals are congruent. So whenever we have a rectangle, we're going to know that segment AH is going to be congruent to segment MT. So the diagonals of a rectangle are always congruent. Okay, now for a rhombus, what's special about a rhombus is that the diagonals are perpendicular. So if we look at a rhombus, and we draw the diagonals, where the diagonals cross, they make a 90-degree angle, so these two diagonals are perpendicular. Now, a rhombus is still a parallelogram, so everything else is true. The diagonals bisect each other, the opposite angles are equal, all that stuff. Another interesting thing is that the diagonals bisect the opposite angles. So what happens is this diagonal comes to this angle and it bisects it, so these two are equal. And so since the opposite angles are equal, these four pieces actually end up being equal. Same thing here. This diagonal bisects this angle, and so now their two pieces are congruent. Alright, the last one is a square. Now, a square is kind of like a combination of a rectangle and a rhombus, so I'm going to repeat myself just a little bit. In a square, the diagonals are congruent. The diagonals are perpendicular, and the diagonals bisect the opposite angles.